Hello and welcome to Oh God What Now? Still 100% committed to being a podcast and not remotely interested in taking over the Labour Party or becoming Prime Minister yet. I'm Andrew Harrison. Today, we're going to step away from the bin fires in Westminster and America to look at something that maybe affects real life in Britain a bit more. Our hopeless record on housing and infrastructure, and specifically on regeneration, the business of fixing up neglected towns and cities to make them better, safer, more prosperous places to live and work. In the early days of New Labour, at the end of the 90s, housing-led regeneration was the orthodoxy. Knock down and rebuild ageing and badly designed estates and flats, the thinking went, and new prosperity and community will follow. Build it and they will come. But regeneration fell down the pecking order as government money and attention grew scarcer. And in 2011, the coalition pulled its backing for major demolish and rebuild schemes, leaving Britain stuck with scarce, ageing housing stock and dying towns. In many cases, regeneration projects turned instead into gentrification projects that left out the very people they were supposed to help. And it's not hard to see how the simmering anger at all this has fed political polarisation, rejection for the major parties, even the promise of violence. So what are we going to do about regeneration? Did it ever really work as advertised? And are there other ways of fixing the most visibly broken parts of broken Britain? With us to explore all this, we've got housing wonk, Ogwen regular, and housing and residential property journalist of the year,
for about another 2 months. Yeah. I didn't enter this year, so you can only hang on to that for about 2 months.
Okay, you can just cling on to it for a bit. This is not a housing question, but it is something that erupted just before we started recording. You like Britpop. Are you looking forward to your Brit card ID card?
No.
Even if it's got a Union Jack on it,
even
like
if it's
suede.
got Dogman Star on the front. No, I'm not. Do you know, my opinion on ID cards has done a complete volte-face since the 2000s when Blair was trying it. Back then, I was very ambivalent. I was also quite young. I think I didn't really think through the serious implications. I am now incredibly concerned about this. And of course, all over social media, there's been people telling me that I'm completely wrong to be concerned about the creeping liberalisation of, our relationship with the state. And I think that they are wrong because it will make their lives better. If you are a middle-class white guy who has all of the latest tech in your pocket all the time, yes, your life will become easier as a result of this. But I'm very concerned about the other people who will be excluded, whether it's digital exclusion, but also, there's a reason that we want to be categorised at the moment. If they think that there's any positive side to being able to tell whether you have a right for any particular service with the political situation that you've just described going on around us, I think that's wrong.
It does seem an odd time to introduce a funny moment when you will both annoy the kind of the left that's unhappy with Starmer, the civil liberties left, and also the kind of no 15-minute cities, cash is king, don't use QR codes, the government's tracking you, conspiracy right.
It feels, for those who read it that way, it will feel like a conspiracy theory and an attempt to control. And for those of us who are very concerned about the environment around immigration at the moment and the treatment of immigrant populations, there are reasons to fear how it will be manipulated by another government other than Starmer's. I also think we're looking at America and what's happening with ICE. It's very naive to think that categorising people right now, it doesn't come as a political weapon in some way.
Well, we're going to be doing a big bunker on this next week to look into it in some more depth. Just to set the scene before we get into the property conversation and housing conversation, how YIMBY are you on a scale of 1 to pave the green belt?
Yeah, I'm quite open to paving some of the green belt. I'm quite YIMBY. I would say I'm 90% YIMBY, yeah.
Okay, right.
90%.
With us, we have a special guest. She's a writer, journalist. She's a reader in architecture at the University of East London. And she's the author of Ground Control, which is about the privatisation of cities, and Big Capital, Who is London For? Welcome to the podcast, Anna Minton.
Thank you very much for having me.
So over the summer, you did a Radio 4 show called Rethinking Social Housing with Andy Burnham. Did you get the vibe of a future Prime Minister radiating off him?
I didn't.
Okay.
I got the vibe of someone who was energetic, in charge of his brief, had lots of good ideas, and he did tap into that vibe of King of the North that he's had about him for quite a while now. But, nothing like what we're seeing now. He seemed exciting. He seemed energised. It was fun to chat with him, but it didn't seem like he was about to swoop in on Westminster.
Does he get the urgency of the housing issue, do you think?
he said all the right things, which is great. But then, look at Manchester, look at Greater Manchester, look at that pattern. You've got all those luxury apartments in Manchester, completely unaffordable developments. And then you've got some of the most deprived parts of the country in places like Salford. So, he's done lots of great things on the buses. Take my hat off to all of that. But look at that polarisation in Greater Manchester. And actually, it's those communities and, all the concerns that we're having at the moment about the far right. It's those communities, those most left behind communities. That's part of that picture. So I'm not sure, actually, how much he does get it.
You've now got me thinking, on the buses, I'll get you, Starmer, having said that. But just before we move on to the housing stuff, how YIMBY are you on a scale of 1 to let's turn Buckingham Palace into flats?
I think I'll sort of throw in a little nuance there. I know it's a sort of a fun question, but it's not about how many homes we build. It's about what homes. We've built a ton of homes. They're just unaffordable luxury apartments. So I'm 0 YIMBY on that one. We've got far too many. But if we're talking about building social housing, large amounts of homes people can really afford to live in, then I become, far more YIMBY.
Hannah, we should really start with where are we now? I mean, most people have the concept of regeneration at the back of their minds, don't really know what it is, where it's happening. They assume that it's trundling along. Can you put a bit more, flesh on the bones of this, a brief history of regeneration?
Yeah, I mean, you did a pretty good job in the intro there. I feel
you.
like you've taken most of my plan for this section. But look, so, the point of regeneration is to spend money in a sensible way that makes a place more livable, whether that's making older social housing stock better quality so that, people thrive in it, whether that's building new private homes so that people come in and start to inhabit a place that they'd left behind. It can mean knocking down and replacing. It can mean building, remodelling existing public space. It can mean a lot of things. It's kind of a catch-all term. In terms of the history of it, the last 30 years have been really interesting because there was, under the Blair years, huge investment. And I know that Anna has real concerns about what that actually looked like in practice. And I think very fair concerns. But there was at least quite a lot of money going into thinking about this stuff, making places better places to live, economically more prosperous and more diverse, better communities. And that was really good, especially for areas of low demand in the north. And there was this big project called the Housing Market Renewal Pathfinders, which was supposed to make very left behind places, really exciting. The problem was halfway through that, we got to the coalition years. It was canned. It was canned literally halfway through, which left residents feeling furious and rightly
Not doing it at all. Worse than not doing it
Worse
at all.
Almost worse than not doing it at all. For some of those people, absolutely, because they might have been moved out temporarily out of their home and then they didn't have the home they were promised at the end. That was part of a massive general pullback from all investment in social housing. And the only place it became possible to do these big regen projects were in metropolitan areas, like big cities, where there was a lot of private investment anyway, often with mayors who had budget control, like London, like Manchester. And there has been progress there, albeit with mixed results, as Anna's already hinted. But other places have been completely left behind. They've literally been left with no support. Their housing stock is coming to the end of its life. There's no money gone in. And yes, we're seeing really awful results in terms of how people feel about where they live, how they feel about themselves. It's really, really deep psychological problems that come from living in bad public space.
Hannah said to me, you've got to ask Anna about Baltimore early on. And I had no idea about this. I just nosed it in a great piece that Hannah wrote. I did not realise that Baltimore is basically patient zero for modern regeneration. You're kind of saying sort of to an extent.
Yeah.
Starting in the mid-70s, where we end up with Canary Wharf and the Albert Dock in Liverpool. Tell me what happened and how it played out.
I think that's a nice, neat way of encapsulating it. I mean, as Hannah said, I'm a skeptic about the whole notion of regeneration. And yeah, it did arguably begin in Baltimore. The idea of regeneration is that as the economy changed, you had these former industrial areas which, had fallen into dereliction, needed lots of work. And the idea was you could use state subsidies to lever in private sector investment. The area would be transformed. The wealth would trickle down, that famous phrase, to the poorer parts just there, which needed it the most. And a rising tide would lift all boats. It's never happened anywhere. Everywhere around the world which had these post-industrial waterfront locations, Canary Wharf, Albert Dock, the Quayside in Newcastle, Salford Quays, Bilbao, South Street Seaport, I think, in New York. All over the world, these waterfront locations, the Manchester, canal sides, they were all regenerated according to this model. And we took a similar approach to regenerating our towns and cities. And we took a similar approach to regenerating old housing, knocking it down, bringing in private sector investment. And what really always has lied behind this approach, the motivation is to raise property prices, increase land values. That is what's behind it. That's simply the approach, increase property prices. Now, it's no surprise when that's your motivation, you end up in a system where if it's worked, i.e. property prices have gone up, lots and lots of people can't afford to live there, because it was never about recreating mixed communities or creating mixed communities. It's always been an American real estate strategy. Now, the irony about Baltimore, which I was telling Hannah about because I was there last year when I was researching my new book, which is about the global housing crisis and the impact of extreme gentrification. The irony is that, all these presentations show these slides in Baltimore in the mid-1970s as this was the first ever scheme. There's a beautiful public space, there's a conference centre, fantastic hotel, new mall, wasn't it wonderful? And the slides are used again and again and again. That quayside now in Baltimore is derelict. The mall is boarded up. It just shows you that 40 years later, it's completely failed. And what they're thinking of doing is just building another one, like a couple of miles up. But the other really, just before I stop, going on, the other thing is, what else do you think about when you think about Baltimore?
The Wire.
Exactly.
Well, actually, I'm watching Homicide: Life on the Streets right now, which is set in Baltimore in the 90s, in that area. And you say, okay, it's a TV show and it's not geographically spot on accurate.
It's pretty accurate.
You see the sharp contrast.
Did it work? It never, ever worked. And it doesn't work anywhere.
Well, I'm going to just push back a little bit because, Liverpool's Albert Dock is one I know a bit about. And it's pretty lively around there, but everybody in the area knows that the flats are footballer flats, local businessman flats, and occasionally in BBC drama, drug dealer flats. It's like the place is jumping. The Liverpool One Centre has transformed things. It's very busy around there. The Albert Dock isn't a white elephant, but it's the housing aspect that hasn't delivered, is what you're saying. Yeah,
and Liverpool is an incredibly polarised city. The city centre is a pretty fun place for people, especially if they have a little bit of money. But then, it's those outlying areas in Liverpool which are completely a world away. And, a lot of people who live there will never go to the Albert Dock. They'll never go to Liverpool One.
You're a long-term opponent of the placemaking trend, the idea that when you knock down lower and middle class housing, you replace it with posh flats and fancy restaurants and gyms. Tell us a bit more about that, because placemaking is kind of a bit of a buzzword, isn't it?
Yeah, it's spin. It's a marketing thing. Regeneration is a buzzword. All of these things are just marketing terms to make it all sound good. Regeneration sounds transformational. We're going to create something new, sort of build from the ashes. Placemaking, how could it be anything but good? Making nice places. But actually, it's all a real estate strategy. Now, that's not to say that there are not people who work in placemaking who do good stuff. It's not all about that. New Labour did have a decent homes programme which upgraded a lot of social housing. But, the Pathfinder market renewal programme that you mentioned, I mean, I was a real opponent of that. I thought that devastated communities. It didn't improve them. It cleared them. It demolished them. People were very, very upset 15 years ago. And regeneration takes a long time, and communities also take a long time to fracture. And yes, it did stop in 2011 and nothing came in its place. Thank God it stopped, but, nothing came in its place.
I think Anna and I disagree a little slightly on this, in that I think she's absolutely right that it is used as a buzzword, that placemaking is thrown around because it sounds great, same with regen. But actually, I think that there are those people who really care about this, and there are examples of genuinely good placemaking, and it wants for a better word to describe it, because there is some real heart and real care around some of the planning that people working in local government, in housing associations are trying to do. And just one example recently of the difficulties those people are facing is Buxton House in Huddersfield, right? This is this high-rise block that is in desperate need of something being done with it. It's bedsits mostly. It's in terrible condition. I spoke to one person working in an organisation called the Northern Housing Consortium who said it's no wonder that we've got mental health problems in this country when people had to endure the pandemic living there. There was this big plan that the local authority had put together to redevelop it, to replace it with good social housing. It would have families in there. It would be a decent place to live. Sort out the street level units so that you had some decent property, and actually possible local businesses could come in and set up their own businesses in the area. But they can't find basically the council cannot, despite going through all the planning processes they need to sign it off, they can't find a contractor that can make it work financially. So there is a massive problem here, that there are great ideas and there just isn't enough funding. And actually that just sitting there with people living in it, living desperate lives, isn't a good example of that.
100% agree. And, when I say placemaking is, it's spin, I'm not saying that actually, good stuff goes on. It completely does. But it's one of those words like sustainability or affordable housing. It's used
to stretch it.
Yeah, it covers such a multitude of sins that I think it's become so meaningless. I'd prefer not to use it.
Taking what you've said about the kind of the spin approach, but also the approach to just increasing land value, a developer or someone on the more commercial side might say, okay, fair enough. You're right. This is not producing social housing. But how else are we going to be able to build ambitiously in oversubscribed places like London and the big cities, without taking that approach? We don't create the commercial environment, we just work within it. They might say, surely the onus is on authorities to ensure that there's enough affordable property required in these developments. And like my own very small experience of this is that, frankly, developers can run rings around local authorities, just whittling down the amount of social and affordable housing until it is basically a little bit of a fig leaf.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I don't think that developers should be the people who we task to provide social and affordable housing. These are huge companies. Their main responsibility is to their shareholders. That's what they're all about. We should be trying to provide homes that people can afford to live in, i.e. homes which are at prices outside of the market in a completely different way. And, for the last 40 years, we've had this experiment where developers have been supposed to provide affordable housing. They never have. And now the situation has become way, way more acute.
Do you think it's becoming more acute because now it is lapping around the ankles of the upper middle classes because their kids can't get houses?
Oh, absolutely. But it's also because of the impact of the financial crash in 2008 and the huge impact that's had on property price inflation, which has just pushed property prices up so much. There's always been a housing crisis all the time I've ever been writing about it. But after 2008, around sort of 2013, 14, it just became, went into the stratosphere.
So if we need to do it differently, what does that look like then? Let's say through a set of circumstances we can't foresee. You have become housing czar. How are we going to do it differently? Because, like I say, the people in the system now are going to say we work within the parameters that are around us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Andy Burnham, when I was on that programme with him, he is doing some interesting work in Manchester around having a land commission in Manchester, and I've been part of a land commission in Southwark. But, these are still tiny little steps. But local authorities have a huge amount of land. There is actually a lot of public land. But politically, there's a sort of straitjacket that says, we can only do it through the private sector, we can only do it through developers, and we can only do it in this way that says we've got to build as much housing as we can, and it doesn't matter if that's very expensive housing. It's an ideological straitjacket. And until, we have leadership that gets out of that, I don't think anything's going to change.
Hannah, we've been talking about, you've been, writing about how regeneration has been getting a bad press, and to an extent, like just adding supply is in. Build a lot if you can. Is that necessarily a good idea? Is it likely to sort of lead us back to kind of 21st century version of the stereotypical 1970s bad estate with no pub and no cafe and no park?
The real risk that at the moment that is what we could head towards, because the government has announced the amount of money that they're going to put into affordable and social housing. And I was right to point out that affordable housing doesn't always mean social housing. There's this real stretching of the definition, and we don't know what percentage of those numbers are going to be. But also, they haven't confirmed yet whether any of the money that is allocated there is going to be able to be used for redeveloping projects that also include redeveloping older social housing and improving it, or whether it's only for projects that are putting new numbers on the ground. And if it's the latter, which everybody fears, and I suspect is probably right, because the government's desperate to demonstrate they're doing something about numbers, or this horrific word that they use, units, which is not what we should ever describe homes and people's homes as.
If you didn't want to be perceived as a top-down socialist command economy thing, don't say units.
Yeah, exactly. It's the most technocratic word.
Yeah.
In use in government. But I think they will do that. I think they will insist that all of that money is spent on new homes in some format. And that is the wrong approach, because it turns its back on those communities that are struggling from these years and years of pulling back.
Now, a listener might be saying, but hang on, you've all just said that, quotes, placemaking is no good. And you just describe you want it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I agree that the word has been distorted, but I'm actually quite a fan of what placemaking is supposed to mean, in that I think that there are real powerful mental, physical and economic health reasons for designing really good places to live, and also doing that, the state doing that, local authorities doing that, not it being done by somebody.
No, well, I would never ever argue with that. Of course, I completely 100% agree with you. The reason I've got a problem with the word is because it's been seized by big developers who build places like Elephant Park, which then wins prizes for placemaking excellence.
So this is, for people not in London, which is most people, Elephant Park used to be at the Elephant and Castle Estate, didn't it? It was not a beloved place. It was a big old style block of flats. People got moved out, got knocked down, and what has been rebuilt has not been reoccupied by the people who used to live there.
That's right, yeah. It's a luxury apartment scheme with hardly any affordable housing in it at all. The definition of affordable housing was changed by Boris Johnson in 2010 when he was mayor to mean up to 80% of market value. So if an average flat there, a two-bed flat, costs £1 million, 80% of market value, I think, excludes quite a lot of people.
£800,000 affordable.
Yeah, exactly.
Not even affordable to Boris Johnson. He's brassic. We all know this. Anna, it does seem strange that, development and regeneration are kind of seen as these kind of grey secondary political issues. All the energy is taken up by stupid things like flags. And yet, it's treated as if it's like just parks and high streets. It doesn't really matter. But in fact, the state of your hometown and where you live is absolutely central to your perception of the state of the country.
100%. And it's connected exactly to issues around flags and people's feelings of grievance about the state of the places that they're living in. I mean, I think it comes back to what Hannah was saying about language and units. that's the language of the spreadsheet, and that's how developers and policymakers think. But this is about people's lives. It's about how they live. So there is that huge disconnect.
Hannah, how do you stop, or how do we, or how does everybody stop the development conversation being all about London? I mean, it is where the journalists are and the politicians. The focus is relentless, but it's, as much, in fact, probably more of a problem outside of London.
Definitely.
And politically, particularly for Labour, because that's where everybody who's losing faith with Labour is.
Yeah, it's not just the north either. It's places like Redruth in Cornwall. Like these kind of old working towns. Obviously, often had a defining industry like mining or whatever. The most depressing thing about this is the reason they're currently left behind after years and years in the doldrums is because these are places now where, because of the spiralling cost of development, of building new property, now the land value and the cost of a new home to sell is less than the cost to build it. So there's no incentive for a developer to go there and do that because they will not make a profit. So the only people who can do this are local authorities, housing associations, but they haven't had the government cash to do it either. So there's loads and loads of communities that are watching things happening in Manchester, in London, in Birmingham, in other places where there is actually a proposition for the private developer and thinking, well, why does my high street look like total shit? Why is my house still horrible to live in, struggling with damp and mould and all the other issues that we're going through at the moment, while over there in the city they're getting X, Y, and Z? And explaining that, it's complicated. This is a conversation here where, Anna and I spend hours reading nerdy policy documents about development models. Most people don't want to hear that, and rightly so. So it's hard to explain what's going on. And secondarily, they don't really care, actually. And why should they? All they should care about is how they feel. And politics has failed them in that sense.
It's not explained properly. The big developers, they're not in the business of building homes. They are land speculators. And it's underpinned by the huge price of land, which has just soared.
Something I know you're very exercised about, Anna, is the gentrification question, right? The idea that it just seems impossible to regenerate existing property without simultaneously driving up the prices, and the neglected part of your town is now full of, expensive coffee shops, and the people who used to live there can't afford to live there anymore. The alternate argument to that is regular working people deserve a nice coffee shop. They deserve a nice park. They deserve a nice place for the kids to play. They probably deserve a decent pub that's got craft ale on the pump and all that kind of thing. This is not just for the middle classes. Can you regenerate areas of our cities without that gentrification aspect that pushes out the people who live there in the first place?
Well, I think the way I'd look at it is that I would say what we're talking about isn't gentrification. Gentrification is all those things that you just talked about, and it's that process whereby Ladbroke Grove and Notting Hill used to be, pretty rough in the 50s and 60s, and in the 70s they became, magnets for filmmakers and artists, and, then in the 90s the film and Hugh Grant, and it became a really expensive area, and that took 30 years, 40 years, and you've seen every single town and city has followed that trajectory. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about something which has happened in the last 10, 15 years, which isn't about bringing in nice coffee shops and craft pubs into areas where actually a mixed economy will coexist for a while, just like down the road here. Highbury and Islington, I just came out of the station. This is a gentrified area, which is still quite a mixed area. But we're not talking about that. We are talking about wholesale replacing areas, replacing their populations, and creating these really sterilised, privatised, samey environments which are, highly surveyed. We were talking about ID cards before. I don't call that gentrification. I think we're talking about a completely different process.
Well, so places like that, Anna, you wrote a big thing about the state of Canary Wharf, which was astonishing. I mean, anybody in London who goes to Canary Wharf at the weekend will feel like they're in a J.G. Ballard novel. It is a complete ghost town. There's nothing there Tell us about what the arc of the Canary Wharf story and what it tells us.
So Canary Wharf was first sort of designed in the 70s, became big in the 80s and 90s. It was exactly what Anna's described, one of these speculative areas where a combination of state investment and then loads and loads of speculation from private
Mega
developers.
tax breaks and special
Massive
planning.
tax breaks, and investment from overseas. We've now got a situation where actually Canary Wharf is mostly owned by the kind of wealth funds of, the Saudi, Omani, loads and loads of completely opaque ownership structures, and we don't know anything about them. But yeah, and in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it became this kind of idea. I remember One Canada Square going on, I think it was in early 90s, wasn't it? Late 80s. And it was it was this kind of the model of the future. This is what work's going to look like. This is what...
It went bankrupt almost immediately, didn't it?
Absolutely. But then it carried on in the early 2000s. All the banks came in. It had this life of its own where all the property went up around it, pushed people out of Limehouse, which was obviously a big working class community. And it became this kind of Monday to Friday, very kind of prosperous on paper place, so you can see all these people running around in suits, but nothing at the weekend, and nothing was done to actually integrate it with all of the surrounding communities in Tower Hamlets, Poplar, and so on. And so it became a place where local people who'd always lived there, they not only didn't feel welcome, they also resented it. There's all this money being brought into my area, but my actual street feels just as horrific. Anyway, since the pandemic, we've seen something really odd happen. So people haven't gone back to, it actually started in the 2008 crash because the banks started to leave. Then we had Brexit, which meant that more banks left and people migrated back into the city and the square mile because they wanted to kind of attach themselves to the glamour of the old city and to hold on to that, their identity in a post-Brexit world. So lost the banks. Then we had the pandemic, which meant that coming into an office 5 days a week ended. We've got absolutely hundreds of thousands, millions of square meters of office floor sitting mostly empty now. And nobody's doing anything about it, partly because the price of London land means that that's still generating cash for the opaque owners and shareholders all around the world. There are plans to, and I think this is quite interesting, to turn it around. One, really around three main areas. Biosciences, so you've got all these large spaces that can be turned into potentially labs. Universities, HE space, we've still, by the skin of our teeth, but we've still got a thriving British higher education system. Come back to me in a year
Nigel
and
will fix that.
ask if
He'll
it's
put
still
an end
going.
to that, yeah.
But at the moment, it's still kind of an exporting and import-export model. We're still bringing people in all the time. So that, education, that sits nicely alongside biosciences. And then also entertainment. And that, to me, is fascinating because it was never a place you went for entertainment. It was a workplace. But now they're trying to do something to save it.
They're always doing weekend festivals and putting music on and DJs. So they're desperate trying to get people in.
Desperately trying to get. But those flats that surround the main tower blocks, the business tower blocks, they still sit empty most of the week. They are profit-holding entities. They are not about living. They're not about life. And it is still a really soulless place. And yet the city, which lost everyone to Canary Wharf for a while, has got everyone back. And why? Because it has some soul. It has history. It is a genuine natural development of an economic centre, whereas this artificial thing that we built in Canary Wharf has now just become an asset strip.
But the real communities that, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in London, they redevelop because basically stuff is dirt cheap enough that artists move in, musicians move in, people who want to do a speculative little shop move in, and that gives it the soul. You just talk about. I can't see how you do that with Canary Wharf. You can do it with Hackney Wick, and you can do it with rope walks around Liverpool. But those big towers,
and all of the artificial attempts to develop it now, all these festivals that you were talking about, they don't work because they feel fake. They're not organic.
Anna, I canvassed some frustrated young people who can't get on the property ladder, as we still call it. And one of them wanted to know which countries have done kind of regeneration and new housing and creating new communities best. Where has it worked? Australia and Finland have got relatively low house prices apparently, but pretty much everywhere else in Europe is struggling with rising house prices. So who's doing it well? Is anybody doing it well?
Yeah, I don't think Australia's a very good example. Sydney's definitely caught up in all of this. So's Melbourne. I mean, just to pick up on the point about gentrification that I was talking about before, and I was saying what we're seeing, it's not gentrification, it's financialisation. Yeah. And Hannah, you were saying Canary Wharf is owned by all of these different global companies. Well, so are all these centres of cities, with all these opaque arrangements, and you don't know who owns it, but who is doing it a bit better. Vienna is famously the example.
Oh, right.
Vienna has 50% social housing. It's the sort of world leader, really. And it's really, really nice social housing. People really want to live in it. It's not a, housing that you get because you can't get anything else. Germany, they're experiencing, in Berlin, a lot of our problems. But compared to what we've got, accommodation for beautiful apartments is still far, far cheaper in Berlin. Quite a lot of markets have elements of rent controls, which are seen as positively Marxist here, but actually they even have rent controls in New York.
Yeah.
So there are examples all over the place. London, Manchester, other British cities, we're outliers. We're among the worst in the world. There are examples, but it needs a wholesale shift, not just small incremental changes. The Netherlands famously, Scandinavia, they have much bigger emphasis on co-housing, cooperative housing.
Hannah, just before we move on, mentioned YIMBYs earlier on. Why is the YIMBY movement so male? You can kind of understand why it's young people, and I kind of get it because the frustration and the anger of I want to buy somewhere and there's nothing to buy. And I can also understand that it's kind of frustrated yuppies, really, isn't it? But where are the women?
Okay, two thoughts. Infrastructure chat in general is quite a male geek thing. If you go on Blue Sky, Twitter, wherever,
898 infrastructure
it's like
chat.
me, Anna, and then a ton of blokes. Sorry, John Elledge, if you're listening.
He's the patron saint, yes.
The other thing is, actually, I think YIMBYs. Honestly, I am quite YIMBY, but I'm YIMBY with some caveats. And one is that it's not always okay to just whack stuff down and just say, oh, well, there's more numbers, so that's fine. And I think YIMBYs are often young and male, and young men, pre-having children often, aren't always very attuned to the needs of everyone else in the community around them. They see it from a very isolated lens. They're not necessarily connecting with all the public services locally and everyone, the extent of the community. And I think sometimes women are a little bit more attuned to that. Often, and especially after having children, you become very connected to all of that. You're taking your child to a class every day. You're meeting the whole of the local society and the parents of that class. It's a different relationship with the state and the local community, and I think that is probably the main reason.
Quick breathing out. It's time for some listener questions in But Your Emails. Remember, you can submit via Patreon or just email them to info@romaniacs.com for that summer of 2016 feeling. This time we asked our patrons for housing questions. And apart from, can you get me a nice 3-bedroom that's close to a park, a Gales and a good school, we got a couple of quite good ones. Callum F. says, I read today that 5 million adults are stuck living with their parents and can't afford to buy a home to move out to. We are never going to solve this without a drastic increase in the number of houses and a drastic decrease in the cost of housing. How can we make older generations who've grown up with the idea that their house will always rocket in value and then can't understand why their kids can't afford to move out, how can we make them realise that the nominal value of their house is going to have to come down if homes are to become more affordable? Firstly, is he right?
Firstly, no.
Okay.
I have to say I think he's right overall in the kind of the general question that there's a cultural thing that we have to unpick. Yeah. But I think he's wrong in the detail of the question that people who, let's say the baby boomers for short, have been used to the fact that their home will always rocket in value. That is not true. In the 90s, a lot of people with negative equity. There were problems around 2008 as well, with some people experiencing negative equity. It hasn't been a straight trajectory for that generation.
But those moments were viewed as aberrations and disgraces that had to be put right.
Absolutely.
House prices are supposed to go up.
Yes, absolutely. And, it is an issue if you've got an economy where loads of people are suddenly in negative equity. That's why Blair partly won the election. By the time he did, the economy was recovered and he benefited from that. But major and, that previous, the 92, was very much hinging on what was coming with, people, financial situation in the UK. So, yeah, they were seen as aberrations and people have banked on it and they've been encouraged to bank on property. That generation were encouraged to treat it as part of their pension provision it was the most stable investment at the time. And so that has to be unpicked. That conversation, that is the kind of necessary and difficult conversation between the generations at the moment, that if your children, middle-aged or younger, are going to thrive in their second half of their life or the second 2/3 of their life, then that's going to have to involve some compromise on you expecting this speculating asset to continue to rise. I mean, already house prices are not rising, actually. They did ridiculously since the pandemic, for like about 3 years, and now that's ended. And I think we're entering a period of complete stagnation. So also, interestingly, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that younger people are much less interested in actually getting on the housing market in the first place because they don't see it as the return that, they're interested in crypto and other stuff.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he's broadly right to see the problem as he sees it, but he's framed it as my parents' generation, they need to change the way they think about this so that my generation can benefit. Of course, that's a normal way to think about it, but it's very sort of individualistic. And, I would see it as a much more systemic issue. It's not about baby boomers having made huge amounts of money and wanting to hold on to their asset. It's much more about having an economy which is completely predicated on growth. We hear it all the time from Rachel Reeves. It's all about growth. And this is a property economy, first and foremost. And if we're going to have growth, we need to have hot housing markets. So actually, that's what they want. So they're in a paradox. To have growth, you've got to have that thriving, if you want to use the word thriving, that very sort of hot housing market. But it's going to keep out half the population. So we're in a complete bind and things need to be rethought in a really, really fundamental way.
I do think there is an appetite for that, though, in a way that there hasn't been among kind of 35 and under. I mean, I'm in my mid-40s and I've already bought into it, but there's a generation below me that are really stuck out and they're actually starting to say this. They're saying, this is a structural problem and I want to be part of the solution.
Another question from LET. Is there any way to stop houses bought at discounted prices via right to buy falling into the hands of private landlords? And I thought it was quite interesting that she asked this. Is money earned via right to buy ring-fenced for providing new housing stock? And it isn't, is it?
Well, I can do my view on the first bit, which is that the only way to do anything about that is to intervene in the market and to legislate and to introduce policy to say that that cannot happen. And Wales and Scotland have been much tougher on right to buy, which is a really positive thing. But again, ideological straitjacket.
It's worth adding that some councils have added some things in. So there are various schemes, but if you sell within 5 years, you lose some or all of your discount. Buyback schemes where the council retains the first right of refusal if you want to sell for up to 10 years. Some council areas have restrictions on who you can sell to. They make sure it's offered to certain demographics and parts of the market, people who've been in place for a long period of time. So you can't sell it on to a remote landlord, a speculator. So there are small projects in place to do that. But yeah, Anne's right. It's nothing overarching.
And the money has never been ring-fenced, has it?
Some councils do ring-fence it, I think, but there's not a restriction.
Okay, we've looked at the mess of the present. What about the future? How are we going to make a difference on the housing crisis over the longer term? So, Anna, this very week, Keir Starmer announced a new levelling up style thing called Pride in Place. It's going to fund 330 places, overlooked communities they are. It's going to include some previously announced things like community rights buy, more compulsory purchase, powers to block bad businesses like bookies and vape shops. What do you think? I mean, does it sound like more of the same?
I mean, more monies for high streets can't be a bad thing. My real objection to the levelling up agenda was that it seemed to be completely based on trickle down and pork barrel politics. I mean, I think what I'd like to see is announcing a really substantial initiative to put a proper amount of money into youth services.
Yeah.
Youth services have been completely decimated up and down the country. Young people have nowhere to go. Why can't they focus on that? Why can't they put millions and millions into youth services? That would make a really big difference.
Yeah, and actually it's the behaviour of young people that is often a determinant of what is your town like. If you've got loads of rampaging kids around being antisocial, then your perception of your town is that it's lawless and falling to bits. And there's no iron rule of teenage behaviour that means you've got to behave like that.
I mean, these are places where all the youth services have gone, all the libraries have gone, all the pubs have gone. They just need to announce something where they can put back this community infrastructure, but using terms that people can actually understand. Like, if you say community right to buy, who cares, frankly? Yeah. But if you actually say, we're going to put your library back, we're going to put your pub back, that might actually draw some support. Your working men's club.
Once again, we're back to communications from the government. Even when they are doing some exciting things, they can't find a way to
Well, I suspect it's because they're not planning to do those things.
Hannah, this looks a lot like a reaction to the popularity of reform, who are very strong in exactly those neglected places, as well as the very prosperous South. Well, that's the second thing. Politically, is it enough to kind of, at this stage of government, to say, well, we're going to bring in investment in your high street or as the horse sort of bolted a little bit?
I mean, it takes so long to see the benefits of those things in a very tangible way where people will say, I feel different, I feel more comfortable, happier, more prosperous in my area. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing it, but it's not an answer to the immediate crisis. I hope that that's not why this has been announced. I don't think it is. I think that some of this stuff was kind of part of the manifesto conversations that were going on, and things have changed very rapidly politically.
Do you think that the brand of what was called levelling up, but is essentially government investment in towns and neglected places? Do you think it's been tarnished by the Boris Johnson experience, where so much of it got channeled into Conservative constituencies, places that didn't need it?
Yeah, I mean, it was, yes, and that's why one of the first things that Angela Rayner did was can it from the department when she was there. I think they're doing still quite a lot of the same stuff. They're just not calling it that for that reason. I think more interesting what's going on at the moment, and probably will have a more immediate impact, but again, not next week, is the devolution of powers and financial control to local mayors. I think that is a very overlooked and really crucial part of the current Labour government's strategy, and one that I really support, but they have said so little about it. And I'm not sure why. Maybe they're worried that a load of reform mayors are going to get elected. Yeah. But that's not an unreasonable fear now. But the actual strategy itself about giving local people, local places, their representatives, the cash and the control to do what actually works there rather than some kind of like central project is a really good idea. And it goes a long way to solving the housing crisis because people understand local need better in their town halls.
Anna, we talk about how development takes place in a kind of predetermined paradigm, and Labour as the rhetoric is very hands-off, pro-development, presume in favour of development, war on NIMBYs, build, don't block. But it's all within that kind of environment of financialised, financialisation of development, land value and so on. where are the bigger ideas? What's happening elsewhere in the world where things are more kind of, what's happening on the bleeding edge of this stuff? Because you're following it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's depressing is that a lot of the problems that we face here are similar in other countries. So, in North America, which is a much more extreme example of a lot of the trends that we have here, it's all about that supply argument. Oh, houses are too expensive. We've just got to build lots more homes. And it's really hard to get beyond that, And so, for example, in Vancouver, which has got some of the highest house prices in the world, they have built like a huge amount more homes, and house prices have just gone up, that bit further. So we've got that research over there in Vancouver. Somebody over there has written a really good book called Broken City. And yet we don't have that ability to connect up what's going on in Canada, what's going on in the US with what's going on here. What you can say is that the sort of so-called Anglo economies, like North America, Australia, the UK, Ireland, we're sort of at the leading edge of the problems. We've got the most extreme, the most rapacious, the most financialized housing system. And Europe, which has got a much stronger municipal public sector, which actually, does do a different type of placemaking. It's not that I'm opposed to, placemaking. It's just the way we do it in this sort of really privatized, trickle-down sort of way.
We're going to reclaim the word.
Europe is more interventionist. Yes, there are really huge problems in some European cities as well. Lisbon, Paris, those sort of touristification kind of cities, but they are a lot more interventionist, and they have a much more mixed economy. It's not just about the private sector. Here it's led by the private sector, but now we've gone one step further. It's all about private equity companies. So, I don't know if you noticed, I mean, the big AI deal when President Trump came over last week, who was it with? Blackstone. Well, Blackstone aren't just going to be a provider of AI. They're right at the centre of Labour's plans to deliver allegedly deliver all of these new homes. Huge private equity company. This is what's driving all our housing policies.
Hannah, what do you think a good development, regeneration, housing policy for the 21st century would look like?
God,
Quickly, in
I'll
two
just
sentences.
solve that in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, it just involves a hell of a lot more state funding and giving it to councils as well as housing associations. I think actually housing associations do very good work. I think a lot of them were manipulated by the market over the last 20 years, but I think they're self-correcting now, post-Grenfell, post Awab's Law, which is the response to the damp and mould crisis, which caused the death of a young child. It was actually a kind of moral correction on the influence that property speculation had. I think they're going to a new chapter, so I do support their efforts. But more money going to actual local authorities to build council housing would be a really good start. That involves raising taxes.
Yeah. Well, fine. I'm going to give you both one command that you can issue to this government right now, because that's a big old spread of things that can be done. Anna, what is your one command that you're going to issue right now to Labour on housing?
Yeah, get out of the ideological straitjacket that housing policy is driven by the big developers.
Hannah?
End shared ownership.
Why?
That's a whole other podcast. But
sure.
basically, it was a manipulative, speculative policy that has made some of the poorest people even poorer and given taxpayers money to do that. And it's trapping people in a dangerous financial product that should never have been created.
Well, after that wander through the secret life of property, it's the end of the show, and that means it's time for Escape Routes. Which new records, books, movies, TV, or other works of art and culture have been giving us refuge from politics lately? Anna, what have you been watching, listening to, going to?
Yeah, I was wondering about what to mention for this. So I thought I'd mention this really silly but really fun drama called Hostage, which is this Netflix political drama about the British Prime Minister and what happens to her when her husband gets taken hostage. And the first episode's not that great, but then it really picks up and it's really compulsive. It's silly, it's fun, and I think the reason it works so well is because it's a bit like Borgen. It kind of presumes that the Prime Minister and the people around her are all kind of like, deep down, they're good guys.
Yeah.
And actually, we don't, it doesn't seem like that anymore.
Well, I don't know. I kind of think, I loved Bergen for that reason. It was basically kind of like, can you juggle the kids and the laundry and running the country and your husband's a bit useless? But the great thing about Bergen was that they weren't just venal and self-seeking, which as fictional characters would just make them cartoons and kind of boring. It's much more interesting if it's like, these real people, they're kind of basically okay. They're doing their best. That sounds great, actually. I'm going to give that a go.
It's really good.
Hostage on Netflix. Hannah Fern, how about you?
I have been reading a book of essays by Lavinia Greenlaw, who's a poet and also wrote a brilliant book called The Importance of Music to Girls. So I would definitely recommend that as well. But this is called The Vast Extent, and it's quite interesting. It's the kind of theme running through it is about how we see and how we understand what we see. So it looks at a range of things from like photographs to sculpture and weather and human faces, but it basically makes you really think about what it is you're observing in your day-to-day life, and it's just really thoughtful. I really like her prose anyway. I think she's fantastic.
Sounds good. Well, mine, this is not the kind of film I would ordinarily watch, but A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which is the fictionalization of Mr. Rogers, the American kids program. Basically, he's played by Tom Hanks. And it's really fascinating because the gist of it is essentially based around a true story where a rather cynical journalist goes and meets Mr. Rogers to write a profile and, turns up with a rather jaundiced view of him and ends up appreciating that he actually really is what you see. He really is basically a decent guy looking out for his community. And this is for Esquire magazine. They ended up putting Mr. Rogers on the cover. The movie came out in 2019, and you watch it now, and what we tend to think of as like the Americans sort of slightly saccharine, a little bit sort of heartwarming and dewy-eyed. Now, well, America just seems to have thrown that away entirely and gone all in on cruelty and stupidity and nastiness and a kind of loathing of your neighbor. I actually found it really moving. It's like in 2019 I would have thought, well, this is kind of rotting my teeth here. It's a bit saccharine. You see it now and you think, my God, you were good people. What have you done to yourselves? Why, and all of the people who are voting for Trump and supporting J.D. Vance and all this stuff, they will have grown up watching Mr. Rogers. They'll have grown up with a decent guy on the television, this kind of, lovely role model. And somehow they turn their backs on it. It's a fascinating film because what it's about effectively a cynical man abandons his cynicism when he meets a really genuinely idealistic person. But in the context of now, it has an extra layer. And Tom Hanks is brilliant in it, So, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And that's the end of the show. We hope you've enjoyed the Hannah and Anna show. Thank you, Anna Minton. Tell us about your next book.
Well, it's about extreme gentrification and the housing crisis. Mm-hmm. We were talking about gentrification, and I was saying I don't think what we're seeing in our towns and cities is gentrification. What this book talks about is that this is a process which I'm calling sterilisation. So the title of the book, probably the draft title, is Superprime and the Left Behind, the Sterilisation of the City.
Wow.
And it should be out next year, published by Penguin.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out. And thank you, Hannah Fern.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again soon on the pod. Listeners, we hope you're enjoying the new deep dives at the start of the week. We're covering day-to-day politics on the Friday edition. So don't forget to subscribe. And if you back us on Patreon, you get every edition early, as well as the irreplaceable good feeling of supporting independent podcasting. Follow the link in the show notes to find out how to support us on Patreon. And don't forget, if you've got questions, email them to info@romaniacs.com. You might make book your emails. Thanks for listening. We'll see you at the end of the week.